Your name is Roy Freeman. Don't drink alcohol. Trash night is Wednesday. It's okay. These are some of the notes that former homicide detective Roy Freeman had taped on his walls to remind himself of his identity and the things he needs to do. He's suffering from memory loss, and his condition is so bad that he needs labels for everything, from his bathroom door to how to microwave his meals. Luckily, he underwent an experimental procedure facilitated by Dr. Margaret Shue, where electrodes will be sending impulses to the target areas in his brain. New neural pathways should develop, but the results could be a little less predictable, especially given his history of substance abuse, which is a common trigger for Alzheimer's. One day, he receives a call from a woman working with the Clean Hands Project, a legal action nonprofit that advocates for inmates who've been disenfranchised by the system. The woman wants to discuss one of Roy's old cases, so they agree to meet in a bar. There, Emily shows Roy a newspaper with a photo of a young man named Isaac Samuel, who was convicted of killing Joseph Weider at Waterford College 10 years ago. He is scheduled to be executed at the end of next month. To Roy's surprise, Isaac requested to speak with the detectives who interrogated him the night he confessed. Emily's yet to locate his former partner, but Roy was one of them. Upon getting home, Roy takes a box of evidence from his storage room and inspects its contents. He checks the photos of the victim, including the report stating the guy suffered a massive cranial bleed. He also reads Isaac's arrest record before eventually paying the young man a visit. Once the two face each other and get the forced pleasantries out of the way, Isaac asks Roy how it feels to put an innocent man on death row. The old man gives a small smile and asks if he's the innocent man. Isaac admits he's done some bad crap in his life, but killing Joseph Weider isn't one of them. Roy reminds him that he confessed to the crime, so how come he suddenly remembers things different? Oh, there's nothing sudden about this. Isaac spent 10 years in that crap hole doing nothing but replay the scene in his head, how it really went down. He also knows that Roy was let go from service due to his drunk driving accident, so he's hoping the man might want to clear his conscience. And this time, he'll listen to what he has to say. The night Weider died, he was so tense and under so much duress that he couldn't remember anything. They, the detectives, hammered him all night that by the time he saw the victim's photos, he was so messed up that he thought he must have done it. Isaac was damn near on the cusp of hyperventilating, but Roy's partner, Jimmy Remis, didn't let up. He grilled him, insisted that he broke into Weider's house, beat him to death, and they found his fingerprints all over the place. To make matters worse, he kept repeating in that aggressive and overbearing voice, "Just admit it, this was you did this." In the end, the sobbing Isaac frantically wrote his confession. Meanwhile, Roy couldn't even look at the scene. After listening to Isaac's piece, Roy asks why he went to Weider's house in the first place. He explains that a year before Weider's death, he stole baby formula for his little man. Weider testified as an expert witness for the DA, and when Isaac told the judge that he was so buzzed out that night he wasn't thinking straight, Weider asserted that he knew exactly what he was doing. As a result, the 18-year-old was tried as an adult. Isaac may look like he had the motive, but he's no killer. He just wanted his son back and thought that the man could help. And so, Isaac waited for Weider's caretaker, Wayne Devereaux, to leave before entering the back door of his house. Isaac was able to make it all the way inside, but someone else came in. While hiding, he could only listen to Weider apologizing to whoever his visitor was before getting killed. Isaac didn't see who the other person was because he panicked and left. Now, Isaac can tell that Roy thinks he's lying. Since that's the case, the young man suggests he ask Richard Finn, who came to see him a few months back. As it turns out, Richard is writing a book about Weider's death. Isaac wants Roy to do his part and help him because the former detective was present when he confessed. He already paid for what he did when he was 18. That said, he's not involved in Weider's killing, and he will die for a crime he did not commit if Roy doesn't make things right. In the evening, Roy reads Finn's witness statement and sees that his old partner Jimmy signed it. The following day, Roy visits Jimmy at his house, and the man's pleased to see him. The last time Jimmy saw him was 10 years ago when their superiors took his badge. He doesn't see the whole drunk driving thing as a big deal since they all drank on the job. Way he sees it, it could have been any of them. He then wonders why Roy isn't drinking the bottle of beer he offered him. So Roy explains that he's doing a clinical trial for his Alzheimer's, and the alcohol will mess with his medication. He also shares that the pulses put in his head were supposed to stimulate memory. To be honest, Roy wouldn't have known it was Jimmy who opened the door if he hadn't called out his name. This is where Jimmy realizes that his old partner has no memory of them working together. In fact, Roy can't remember his whole life, and Jimmy's wife, Kat, who died the previous year from cancer. Roy then asks if he remembers Isaac Samuel's case, leading Jimmy to assume he's been speaking with the lady from the advocacy group, who he didn't answer. Roy reveals what Isaac shared with him, and says the young man was convincing. But to Jimmy, anyone put on death row will say they're innocent. Roy adds that Isaac mentioned Richard Finn visiting him. When asked if he knows who that is, Jimmy says he doesn't remember because it was a long time ago. Well, the weird thing is, he read the case file, and when they dusted Weider's house, Finn's prints were all over the place. So, they were there, who cares? Jimmy asks. See, Finn claimed in his statement that he wasn't there during the night of the murder, and they never corroborated his whereabouts. They never followed it up, and Roy just finds it a bit strange. And strange it is. Let's look at how Isaac was interrogated. If his memory's to be believed, this is a clear-cut case of a coerced confession. Coerced confessions come from extortive, overbearing, and forceful law enforcement conduct ranging from bullying to flat-out torture. As for Jimmy, he was bullying the hell out of Isaac. His interrogation techniques were questionable at best, unethical at worst. Based on what Isaac said about them hammering him all night, we can infer that he was interrogated for long periods without breaks. He also said that he was so strung out that by the time he saw the photos, he thought he really did it. If Isaac was telling the truth, then this means that Jimmy likely interrogated a sleep-deprived suspect under immense stress that he, himself, induced. If you put enough pressure on someone who you've rendered physiologically and maybe even psychologically unwell, they're gonna start questioning their own reality. And if Roy's downcast look is anything to go by, he looked like he wanted to be anywhere but that room. Then, for the next discrepancy. When Jimmy was pressuring Isaac into confessing, he outright said that they found Isaac's fingerprints all over the house. If the convict were telling the truth, then it should be improbable for his prints to be everywhere since he just entered from the back, hid, then left. Add in this Richard Finn fellow, whose prints were actually found in the house yet his alibi was never corroborated. Then the whole situation starts getting suspicious. After all, Jimmy was very adamant about coaxing a confession from Isaac while he didn't care about the actual prints found there. Roy and Jimmy weren't rookies when they handled the case, so if they made such a glaring oversight, it wasn't a rookie mistake they were making. Now Roy is hoping that he and Jimmy could maybe talk to Finn and see what he has to say for himself. Unconvinced, Jimmy asks why, and a sheepish Roy answers that it's just a feeling, which is all he has to go on these days. Besides, Doctor told him to keep his head busy. Despite his initial hesitance, Jimmy promises to ask around and reach out to some of his friends who are still on the job. That night, Roy checks some pictures and sees a newspaper clipping about him, reporting he was on life support after his DUI-induced accident. He then takes a framed photograph of a married couple, but doesn't see their faces because the glass is cracked, spurring a memory about dancing with a woman. Curious, Roy tries to break the glass entirely, but cuts his finger instead, causing him to remember Vider as he lay dead in his house. Seconds later, Roy answers Jimmy's call and learns he's found Finn. Unfortunately, their meeting place is the morgue. Richard Finn supposedly died from fentanyl OD, but Roy notices that there's only one needle hole in his arm, no track marks either. Jimmy simply thinks he's a newbie, but Roy says he remembers seeing Finn at Vider's house while they were there. With Roy bringing up Finn's involvement and unchecked alibi again, Jimmy stresses that Isaac's prints were all over Vider's house too, and aside from having a motive, he confessed. Despite this, Roy is still confused. After Finn's burial, Roy approaches his brother, Eddie, for information about the man, or his book, and he learns that Finn and his wife weren't exactly on good terms. Luckily, Eddie found the copy of his manuscript in his apartment, and he's giving it to Roy. It's called The Book of Mirrors, which, to Eddie, was just about a girl he was obsessed with in college. Eddie admits he wasn't close to Finn, for his brother wasn't the type of person anyone would want to get close to. That said, he never knew Finn to be a substance user. The previous year, though, Eddie noticed that something didn't seem right about Finn. His brother became agitated and paranoid. In the evening, Roy reads The Book of Mirrors, which is about memories and Vider. In the book, Finn talked about meeting the brilliant Laura Baines, a very decorated polymath who seemed to know everything about everything. Double bachelors in art history and neuroscience, spoke 5 languages, the works. She knew exactly who she was, and looking back, Finn wished he did too. She was going around talking to everybody there before eventually approaching Finn. Her opener was "How's the punch?" and he jokingly retorts that with the way she's been skulking around and leering at him, he'd hoped she had something better than "How's the punch?", which amuses Laura as he's basically framing her as some kind of serial killer. Though Finn had a clear awkwardness to him, he's able to banter effortlessly, if not audaciously too. She shared her thesis was about memory reconsolidation through accelerated resolution therapy, and she's from the psychology department. She's there with Professor Joseph Weider, who's administering her thesis. She's also helping him with some research. They slept together that night, and from that moment on, the two became intimate and inseparable. But after some months, Finn's father died of a heart attack, so his mother could no longer afford his room and board. Thankfully, Laura wanted to help. She invited him over to Vider's place, and over dinner, Finn shared his desire to write literary memoirs. Per his distinction, traditional memoirs are about someone's life story, and the genre is not concerned with questions of truth, imagination, memory, or style. But for literary memoirs, the author's telling the truth of the story as they believe it to be true. Laura then asked Vider to do the thing to explain to Finn what they're working on. With that, Vider told Finn to pick any memory from childhood and something he wished to forget. He was hesitant at first, but he recounted how he got scared one time when he went to the toy store with his mother and got lost. He eventually found his mother outside, smoking, and as Finn recalled this, he admitted he'd forgotten all about it. According to Laura, Vider's research centered on people's trauma, and it talked about how the mind blocked those memories from ever actually presenting. While she's explaining, Finn noticed how she was holding the professor's hand. Vider then noted that the trauma he experienced that day was his mother abandoning him. The experience was too hard to process, so he suppressed it from memory. However, the effects of that trauma still lingered in his subconscious, and became part of the fabric of who he was. After explaining this, the professor took Finn to his study, where he offered him $500 a week to organize all his books and classify them electronically. New worlds opened up as Finn worked for Vider, but eventually, all the time Finn had spent at Vider's place exposed him to something he wasn't expecting. Laura and the professor were a little too close. One night she told him she was coming home late, but instead of waiting for her, he went to Vider's office. Outside, he heard her being intimate with the professor. The following day, Finn went to work as usual and found Vider's manuscript called The Mirror Effect. When the professor saw him, he realized that Laura handwrote her name on his manuscript too, since it only credited him. Vider then urged Finn to join him for lunch and asked how things were going between him and Laura. Finn claimed they were just friends, but the professor begged to differ. Despite that, Vider thought it would be better if Finn and Laura stopped seeing each other. He reminded the student that she brought him to Vider's life to help, not complicate things. As such, he'll be going out of town to meet some people about his book. That should give them enough time to figure out a new arrangement by the time he returned. When Finn went home that night, he realized that Laura had left him. The day after, Vider was found dead in his house, beaten to death, and some hophead had already confessed to the crime. That's where he saw the two detectives. He went on to become a novelist of no repute. toiling in obscurity. In addition, he discovered that a week before Veter's death, Laura went to see the professor's contact at the Department of Defense, Susan Avery. She wanted to claim ownership over Veter's work, but she was told that wasn't possible because the US government commissioned the study, so the grant was for the professor. Furious, Laura pointed out that she wrote it, and again, she was rejected. Susan suggested she discuss the matter with the university, or with Veter himself. There was nothing she could do, even if Laura wrote The Mirror Effect, and Veter just slapped his name on it. Needless to say, she was furious. Laura disappeared after Veter's death. It's like she's fallen off the face of the earth, until Finn saw her again. Unfortunately for Roy, that's where the manuscript ended. Roy now has another suspect added to his list, Laura Baines. She had a clear-cut motive since Veter was getting in the way of the grant that she claimed to be rightfully hers, and she was barred from it a week before the incident. If there's anyone who'll benefit from Veter's death, it's Laura. This doesn't absolve Finn, however. He said it himself. Literary memoirs are written based on the author's perception of the truth. It comes from their own memory and experiences with the subject, and as everyone knows, memory is a fickle thing that can be replaced, distorted, and overwritten, especially with the passage of time. So Finn's book can't be looked at as the end-all-be-all source of truth. Consider the way he depicted Laura. When they first met, the serial killer comment was offhandedly thrown, but it plants that seed of thought in the reader's mind. In other words, he's setting her up to be the killer in a very literary way. Besides, he could simply be lying too. And if Veter was getting in the way of his relationship with Laura, he'd also have a motive. As long as Finn is a suspect, Jimmy still remains tied to all of this. He's the one who forced a confession out of Isaac, and whenever Roy would bring up Finn's possible involvement, Jimmy kept doubling down on Isaac. Reading the inconclusive book leaves Roy frustrated. He then meets up with Jimmy and tells him about what he's learned. He only managed to track down Finn's ex-wife, but everyone from Veter's last days vanished. Suddenly, he sees Laura passing him by. Despite his shock, he immediately catches up to her, only to realize that he's got the wrong woman. He then visits Dr. Shu, who states that hallucinations are often a common byproduct of his procedure. Still, Roy is puzzled since he's only seen a picture of Laura, but the doctor explains it indicates recall, even if the person he saw wasn't really her. It's the same with the snippets of memory he's reported, meaning his neural pathways are starting to reactivate. In other words, his treatment is working. Later, Roy visits Finn's sullen ex-wife Dana, who stresses that Finn was many things: paranoid, deluded, a real misanthrope, but he was never into any form of illegal substances. She does, however, believe that a certain Elizabeth Westlake had something to do with Finn's death. She disdainfully describes her as a crazy freak who had a huge argument with Finn a few weeks before he moved out. He started drinking again, and one night, he came home screaming on the phone, all pissed. He yelled at Elizabeth not to lie to him before saying that he's aware of what she did. She's not getting away with it. Dana tried not to talk to Finn when he was like that, so she waited until he was asleep before checking his phone. The next day, Dana called the unknown number and got Elizabeth's voicemail. Roy thinks that she knows Elizabeth since she called her crazy, but Dana knows nothing about her and her connection to Finn. All she knows is that he never talked to anyone the way he talked to Elizabeth. Truth be told, she thinks Elizabeth killed Finn. At home, Roy looks up who Elizabeth Westlake is, and to his surprise, one photo of Laura pops up. He then clicks it, and is directed to Laura's website, which shows her new identity and work. Wasting no time, Roy tracks Laura in the morning, not expecting her to recognize him. Just like that, he recalls meeting Laura before. When he mentions his condition, the woman says they met in passing a long time ago. Aside from that, she's read about Roy's accident in the newspaper. When Roy asks her about Finn, she suddenly gets choked up and reveals that he used to stalk her, made her feel like she always had to look over her shoulder. This is when Roy explains that Finn believes she had something to do with Veter's death, but he never got the chance to speak to him because he passed away. At his subtle insistence, she begrudgingly takes the memoir before asking Roy to take care of himself and getting in her car. Next up, Roy manages to get a background report on Wayne, so he visits the former caretaker. Wayne's shared this before, but he recounts how Veter helped him get back on his feet and find a job as a maintenance man. Veter was running a trial for important people out of his department at the college, trauma patients. He was testing a medication he'd developed. Since Wayne used to be a soldier, Veter thought he was a perfect candidate for his research. Through medicine and suggestion, the professor offered to help replace his bad memories with good ones, and even erase them altogether. Without hesitation, Wayne signed up for it. Veter claimed it was effective for dealing with PTSD, but that was only part of the treatment. The rest was the medication Veter developed, which he stressed could wipe the slate clean. The medication worked for a time for Wayne, but the pills had some serious side effects. While taking them, Wayne just couldn't recognize himself anymore. He'd throw up and experience blackouts, so he eventually stopped taking them against Veter's wishes. After telling his story, Wayne offers to give Roy a ride back home. Then, while inside the truck, Roy asks the caretaker if he knows anything about Laura. For Wayne, no one ever really knew her. He's not sure if Laura and Veter were a thing, but from what the professor said, the woman was just his lab assistant. Maybe she wanted them to be, but Wayne never saw it. Besides, there were a lot of women in Veter's life, and Wayne reveals that the professor kept a record of them too, using an old-school camcorder. In fact, he's seen some of Veter's tapes. Laura never called him out on it, though. Only time they ever spoke was about their research paper. But one time, Wayne heard Laura and Veter arguing about some research paper they were writing. Then, on the day Veter died, Laura and Finn came over to the professor's house. Wayne witnessed the three fighting, but while he wasn't sure what they were talking about, he knew that Finn got really pissed. The guy was accusing Veter of something and calling him a liar before storming out, saying that he and Laura deserve each other. Wayne tried to talk to Finn, but he didn't catch up to him. Later, Wayne saw Laura leave in a taxi, and after work, he went to the old Warren to have a drink. The bartender there, Diane, was one of Veter's girls, and he had a video on her. Now, outside Roy's house, Wayne says that Weeder was a good man who simply lost his way. Roy then thanks the caretaker for the lift before getting out of the truck, but instead of leaving immediately, Wayne calls someone to inform them that the former detective is home. Once again, Roy checks the evidence they've gathered relating to Weeder's case and sees that all witness statements were signed by Jimmy alone, which confuses Roy because all the witness statements from their other cases were signed by the two of them. Moments later, Laura shows up at Roy's place while Jimmy watches from a distance. Inside, Laura checks the evidence wall before saying that everything Finn said in his book was a lie because she was never in a relationship with him. To this, Roy mentions Wayne confirmed a lot of things written in Finn's book, but Laura simply reminds him that he's a soldier suffering from PTSD, and many traumatized vets turn to escapist inventions from video games, books, and adult material. Besides, he resented what Weeder's research did to him. He became prone to bouts of anger and aggression. This, Laura knows, because she transcribed the professor's patient notes. In the end, Weeder didn't get to publish his findings because he died. To make things worse for Laura, she didn't even get the credit she deserved. On that note, Roy informs her that he's reached out to Weeder's DOD contact, Susan Avery, who's taken over the professor's department at Waterford. Now, this isn't a conversation she'd enjoy to have while sober. Laura gets up to leave, but not without telling Roy that he used to love a good drink. This is quickly becoming a case of he said, she said. Nobody's account is painting a clear picture, only fragments. Looking at Wayne's account of what happened, it raises the question, why didn't Finn mention the fight in his manuscript? That would have been the last time he and Weeder saw each other, but the book made it seem like their last conversation was Weeder telling him to break things off with Laura. On that note, him writing that she and the professor were being intimate, touchy-feely even, are at odds with Wayne pointing out that Weeder and Laura only ever talked when it was about their research, which doesn't bode intimacy, and given their earlier animosity, it's rather far-fetched for Finn to be looking for Laura the way he did back in his home the night of Weeder's death. But that's one of the sounder pieces of the puzzle. It's hard to tell whether Finn and Laura were in a relationship, but what's clear is that Laura's motive remains the same, no matter who's telling the story, and she still has the most to gain from his death. Both Finn and Wayne had the same thing to say about her too. Nobody truly knew who she was. Wayne at least had a kind word to say about Weeder, but it's still worth noting that 1. He was talking to someone who knows about Roy, and 2. He's a disenfranchised individual who had, at one point, become a stranger to himself because of Weeder's experiment. Laura claimed that he resented the treatment and became prone to aggression as a result. So based on the available information of all the current suspects, Wayne is the most predisposed to violence. He's already a trained killer, and based on his little phone call, he's keeping some kind of tabs on Roy, just like Jimmy is. One evening, Roy finds a gun in a cereal box while looking for food. He then takes it and leaves to buy something to eat, but on his way home, someone attempts to run him over with a truck. Thinking quickly, he gets out of the way and repeatedly shoots the driver, causing the vehicle to crash. To Roy's surprise, the person who tried to kill him is none other than Wayne. He quickly calls 911 and reports what happened, and while an officer reads him his rights in the station, Jimmy arrives to get him out of there. Next, the two go to a bar, where Jimmy tells Roy that CCTV's caught Wayne trying to run him down. He promises he'll help prove that Roy only defended himself. Moreover, he shares that 2 vials of fentanyl were found in Wayne's truck, the same substance that killed Finn. The authorities are assuming Wayne killed Finn since he didn't want to be implicated in Weeder's death, but Roy thinks this makes no sense. His book was 100% pointing to Laura, aka Elizabeth Westlake, as the killer. Exasperated, Jimmy repeats that Isaac confessed to killing Weeder. In 1 month, there will be justice, and the guy will be dead. Roy's beginning to feel even more lost and defeated, so in a moment of vulnerability, he asks if he was a good cop. The question briefly takes Jimmy aback, but he stresses that he was one of the best. Roy was a great cop. He then mentions that his name wasn't on any of the sign-offs in Weeder's file when, in the 30 years that they worked together, they always co-signed. At this point, Jimmy can't ignore what he's insinuating anymore. Roy showed up at his doorstep after 10 whole years, asking for his help, and now he has the gall to accuse him? He cusses Roy out and leaves. After several brushes with alcohol, Roy finally gives in and drinks. He drinks and drinks while thinking about everyone involved in Weeder's death. He also recalls looking for a woman in another bar, but the owner said she wouldn't be coming in for a while. In the morning, Roy wakes up on a couch in the street and realizes he's jotted down Diane's name and workplace. He goes to the old Warren, where he and Jimmy celebrated years ago. In a flashback, it is revealed that Roy thanked Jimmy for something he did before taking the man's car keys. Back in the present, he looks for Eric O'Toole, the old owner of the bar. The bartender he's talking to says O'Toole is retired, and when Roy asks if he knows Diane, the guy tells him she died 5 years ago. In the restroom, Roy recalls seeing a terrified Diane entering her car and being in Weeder's house, investigating his death. Afterward, he receives a call from Susan, whom he meets later. Susan gives Roy a copy of Weeder's The Mirror Effect, which was never published under the professor's name, because Laura, or Elizabeth, updated his research with additional findings she culled together over the years. Simply put, Laura stole Weeder's work. Susan also reveals that Laura came to her with that manuscript before Weeder died and claimed the work was hers. After talking to Susan, Roy visits Weeder's place, which triggers more and more memories to flash in his head. He remembers vague details of their investigation, how the morning they were called into the house, one of the signed baseball bats in the garage was missing. Roy heads to the garage again and picks up a shovel, which during their first investigation was dirty. Once in the yard, he uses a wire to check the ground before finding a soft spot. He digs it up and discovers the missing bat, but while he's wiping the dirt off it, Laura suddenly shows up. She slyly mocks him, saying that he and his partner never did find the murder weapon. But to both of their shock, Jimmy suddenly shows up, gun in hand. He wants Roy to put the bat back in the hole, and for the two of them to get inside the house. There, Jimmy berates Roy for not letting go of this mess, which he had painstakingly cleaned 10 years ago. He asks if Roy remembers what Diane did, and Laura's quick to add that Diane was one of Vider's patients. Jimmy snaps at her to be quiet, and Roy realizes they know each other. Because of their connection, Roy concludes that Jimmy got deep in debt because of his sick wife, and when he met Laura, the woman paid him to kill Vider so she could publish her book. He probably railroaded Isaac before covering everything up. However, Laura stresses she only met Jimmy after Roy's accident. At that point, she was hopeless because she knew her name would always be associated with Vider's death, and she was facing losing years of clinical research. That's when Jimmy showed up and asked her all sorts of questions, which scared her. So she moved away, changed her name, and started over. She even managed to publish her book. The only problem is, a few years ago, Finn started poking around and talked to Jimmy about how she changed her identity to take over Vider's work. Finn was sure she killed the professor, prompting Jimmy to get the original copy of the mirror effect from their evidence box, and track down Laura to blackmail her for money. An incredulous Jimmy asserts that what she's saying is bullcrap, but Laura doubles down on her story. Because of this, Roy assumes Jimmy killed Finn too, in case the guy got the same idea. Jimmy can't believe what he's hearing. No, he didn't kill anyone. Laura offed Finn the same way she offed Vider, using other people's hands. She told Wayne that Finn was writing a book about Vider's demise, and that the writer believed he was the killer. So, Wayne staged Finn's death and made it look like an OD. He also called Laura earlier to inform her Roy was home, and the woman ordered him to take care of the situation. Jimmy wants Laura to be held accountable for manipulating the people around her, but before he can even do anything, she suddenly shoots him. Next, Laura turns to shoot Roy, but while she's making her little speech about the human mind, Jimmy shoots her with his last remaining strength. The whole ordeal's left Roy completely speechless. He picks up the guns, but as he approaches Jimmy, his old partner whispers that everything he did for Roy. After Laura and Jimmy's deaths, Roy gives his testimony to the authorities, while Isaac is finally released from prison. Roy continues his therapy sessions with Dr. Shu, and this time, he's able to remember details of his life he wasn't able to before. Now that that's over, it's time for Roy's life to return to normal. He's clearing his evidence wall at home when he sees the framed photograph again. This time, he decides to remove the broken shards of glass, which leads him to a horrifying discovery. He and Diane are the married couple in the picture. As a result, he remembers his meeting with Laura years ago. They're at Diane's bar, and Laura's telling him that his wife came to Vider 6 months ago to talk about her unresolved trauma. She had an alcoholic father, and she's worried that she's seeing the same patterns in her marriage with Roy. She was vulnerable, and Vider took advantage of her. Diane apologized for being the one to break the news to him, but Roy only scoffed at her. What's she telling him this for? He didn't buy her Good Samaritan act for one bit. Instead of arguing, Laura just gave Roy Diane's tape with Vider, which the detective watched at home. As it turns out, the woman Roy remembered dancing with was Diane, who only wanted him to let her go. She was desperate to get away from him. In a fit of blind rage, Roy went to the professor's place and beat him to death using one of his bats, not knowing Isaac was there. It wasn't long before Jimmy arrived and stopped him, and the two agreed to bury the bat just outside the house. Now, as he sits inside his lonely home, Roy takes his gun and gets up, struggling to process everything he's learned. While Vider spent the last months or even years of his life finding a way to suppress one's most traumatic memories, Roy was unknowingly walking backwards, right into his own, after spending almost a decade without them. Now, he knows that Laura used him to take out Vider for her without even outright telling him to. He's also saddled with the burden that an innocent man lost 10 years of his life paying for a crime Roy committed, that his friend broke every rule in the book for him, and that Jimmy died because Roy never realized that the perp he's been looking for was himself all along. It's just as Vider said, you could bury your memory, but the effects of the trauma will still linger. Ignorance is only bliss when you don't know you're ignorant. But he realized too late that his life would have been much quieter if he'd just let sleeping dogs lie.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.